hoped for, that 3 years after the Water Act was legislated for, this government has not managed to get a guide that's been released that actually has sufficient socio-economic analysis to it, that actually spells out distinctly and clearly for upstream communities what the environmental benefit for some of their key environmental assets will be. It's great for those of us in SA to know what the proposed extra flows through the Murray Mouth are, but what about the lower Goulburn floodplains that are identified in the report, yet there's absolutely nothing to say how more frequently they will get an extra drink, or what benefit there will be to them, or any other individual upstream asset that perhaps those communities who are being asked to pay a price might like to see what benefit they get too.
Kelvin Thomson, on to another issue. We will see now the debate on Afghanistan proceed on Tuesday. It's obvious the debate that a great many people in Australia would be interested in hearing. Why should Australia remain in Afghanistan?
Well, in the first place, Chris, I welcome the fact that there's going to be a debate on this. I welcome the fact that the Greens have initiated that, and indeed I think that there should be a role for the Parliament before governments make decisions to take us to war in circumstances other than of direct attack. It seems to me that there is a role for the Parliament in considering these issues, and that the decision to go to war is so important and so fundamental that it ought to be the subject of bipartisan and preferably multi-partisan support. The decision to go to Afghanistan was taken, of course, in the wake of the attacks of September 11, 2001. The conduct of the Taliban-led Afghanistan government at the time was outrageous. They were clearly harbouring Osama bin Laden, and it seemed, no doubt to the United States and no doubt to the Australian government at the time, that if action was not taken in relation to Afghanistan, that we could be the subject of terrorist attacks from that source.
Simon Birmingham?
Chris, I think in relation to a parliamentary debate on Afghanistan, any open discussion, any open debate in the Parliament is always welcome, and I'm sure that coalition members will welcome the opportunity to have their say. On a personal perspective, I certainly look forward to the opportunity to spell out why I've supported the approach that's been taken over the years. The reality is, as Kelvin has said, that we were confronted by a terrible situation in Afghanistan with the Taliban, with the threat they posed, not just to regional security but to global security, and the threat of terrorism that came with the Taliban's operations. Now, we've had some successes there. They haven't been as great and as fast and as easy as perhaps people would have hoped. And of course we need to look at how we get through the next couple of years, if that's how long it takes, however long it is, to get a successful outcome that leaves Afghanistan as stable as possible for the country and as secure as possible for the rest of the world in terms of the threat that it can pose to terrorism.
And what do you think of Kelvin's idea that Parliament should have a role in having a say before we go to war, which is of course a congressional thing? The Congress does have a say on whether or not the United States goes to war, even though the President is the Commander-in-Chief.
Ideally, there's some attractiveness to that idea. Practically, there are some challenges to it as well, Chris, and I think even the US grappled with some of those challenges during the Afghan and Iraq wars that were launched. I think it's probably a good topic for inclusion in this debate, if I can put it that way. I've got no doubt that Kelvin will raise it and other members will raise it, and perhaps we'll be able to see that as an outcome from this debate to some extent, or at least clarity as to when it would be appropriate and when it's not appropriate to engage the Parliament in such debates.
Kelvin, will you be proposing it in the parliamentary debate?
I'm looking forward to the opportunity to speak, Chris, and indeed the opportunity to raise that issue. It would be quite possible to amend the Defence Act to require parliamentary approval before Australia were to send troops to war. Now, clearly there are some practical challenges. Obviously, in the event that we were attacked, the government would need to have the capacity to take executive action. But I think in the sorts of situations we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, it is appropriate for the Parliament to consider these matters.
Now, we saw Greg Combet yesterday talking about wanting to move on climate change, and he did really throw down the challenge or the gauntlet to the Greens to a certain extent, saying that they would have to compromise. They have managed, Simon Birmingham, haven't they, for a long time, to be a party that stood apart from politics. Now their role will be changing and they'll be judged on the decisions that they make.
Well, the Greens have managed to position themselves as a protest party, as a party that really does run itself as a commentator rather than a decider in the political process. And they've done that under governments of all persuasions. In July next year, they will hold the outright balance of power in the Australian Senate. That's an important position that any party can hold, and it's one they're going to need to exercise with far more responsibility than they've shown in the past in terms of dealing with both government and opposition in a rational way that does involve compromise. Now, I think Greg Combay is probably trying to look a little tougher than the government's being with the Greens on this topic. They seem to be giving the Greens everything they want at present, and this is just a bit of spin and manoeuvring. But over the long term, whoever's in government in the future, if the Greens are occupying that position, they're going to have to be willing to play ball with governments and oppositions of the day in a far more sensible way than they have.
OK, last word then goes to Kelvin Thomson, obviously on the Greens, and it is a real problem for the Labor Party too, and positioning itself with the Greens now, whether or not you're going to be in a permanent coalition if the Greens continue to rise in power.
Well, the immediate situation, Chris, as you say, is that they are now represented both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, where they'll have the balance of power from July next year. I hope that there is agreement for action on climate change. I think that Australia needs to stop its trajectory of carbon emissions constantly rising. We need to have an agreed plan, a path forward to reduce our carbon emissions to meet those science-based targets. And in terms of general parliamentary outcomes, I think everyone who's in the Parliament has to shoulder some responsibility for the outcomes. So if Parliament doesn't solve people's problems, then every party that's there, the Labor Party, Liberal Party, Greens, has to accept some responsibility for that.
Well, gentlemen, I can see that the Phoenix 2 has reached the bottom of that shaft again in what must be one of the most amazing rescue missions in history. So we'll leave it there and thank you.
Good to talk with you.
Thanks very much, Chris, Kelvin, cheers.
And we will take you back to